Hello, everyone, and welcome to a little mini bonus episode 301 of the Canadian Football Countdown, a proud member of the Canadian Football Podcast Network and the Alternative Football Network. Just Ryan here with you today for the Labor Day weekend CFL Fantasy Fix for week number 13. Wednesday night, we did our big 300th episode, Ask Me Anything. It was a lot of fun, great questions sent in by our listeners. We had a lot of fun going through that. Didn't have time for a ton of fantasy talk, but it's a tough weekend of CFL fantasy this week with only 3 games on the schedule, not a lot of value plays out there. So figured we'd put out a little mini bonus episode where I have a bit more time to dive deep into the CFL fantasy options at each of the positions. So we'll go through all the options at every position on the field here today in a quick but mini bonus episode, not as long as usual, I hope. And we'll go through everything for week 13 of the CFL fantasy slate here. I am doing so live on all of our usual platforms, thanks to our presenting sponsor, Game Time TV, which you can learn more at gametimetv.ca or facebook.com/gametimetvmb. And before I start diving into things, I always want to acknowledge that the Canadian Football Countdown is brought to you from Treaty 1 territory, traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples in the homeland of the Métis Nation, as well as from Treaty 4 territory, traditional territory of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis Nation. Quick reminder off the top of the show as well to check out our Discord community. Link is in the episode description. It's free to join us over there. If you enjoy this short form CFL fantasy content, if you enjoy all the stats I'm about to give as we look through the options at each of the positions, because I send many more of those in there, charts aplenty that have all of this information easily available to you, and that's the best place where you can get that info. So links in the episode description. Free to join us over there. Hope to see you over in the Canadian Football Countdown Discord community. But without further ado, let's dive into CFL Fantasy for week number 13. We'll start with the most important position on the field. It's the quarterbacks. Again, 3 games on the schedule, 3 rivalry games on the schedule this weekend. You've got Winnipeg and Saskatchewan. You've got Edmonton and Calgary. You've got Toronto and Hamilton. Means only 6 starting quarterbacks available to choose from. And this is a position where, maybe some previous weeks you got away with a cheap play. Maybe you went with the Dustin Crum play last week and worked out for you. But this time around, you're going to have to spend money at the quarterback position. Zach Collaros is the cheapest starter at $12.5K. Most of the starters are at $15. Cody Fajardo is about saves you $1,000 over them if you want to go that route. But taking a look at the quarterbacks, let's start by narrowing down the playing field here. There's 2 quarterbacks that aren't really in consideration for me at all for this week. And number 1, that's Zach Collaros. He had one of his best games of the year last week, still only hit 15.3 points in the process. He's been the 6th best QB or worse in every week but 1 so far this season. So Collaros, yes, he's the cheaper play. I know it might be tempting to go that route to save some money, but he hasn't been delivering fantasy totals all year, and the Riders' defense has been surprisingly really picked it up in the passing department lately. They've held opponents under 225 passing yards in 3 straight games, and in those 3 games, they've only allowed 3 passing touchdowns and registered 5 interceptions. The other one I'm staying away from entirely is Vernon Adams Jr. He's not delivering like I expected him to in Calgary on the fantasy stat sheet so far this year. 25 or less pass attempts in 4 of his last 5 games. He's just not getting the passing volume. They run the ball a lot with Dedrick Mills. And when you compare him to some of the other guys we're about to talk to that are throwing the ball, average 13, 15 more times a game, perhaps, I like the volume of those other guys a little bit better. Same thing in terms of his passing yardage. Outside of one outlier game of 428 yards, he's averaging just 250 a game on the year. So Vernon Adams, great quarterback, love the guy. Calgary's doing great things, but he's not delivering on the fantasy stats sheet. That narrows it down to these final 4. And kind of in the middle of the pack, I have Cody Fajardo at my number 4 option here. Finished as a middle of the pack quarterback in 4 straight games. He finishes around the QB4, QB5. That's fine at a cheaper price, but not when he's, basically the same price as all of the other guys out there on the field. I know he saves you a little bit of money, but he's no longer the cheap value play. So I want to start seeing him deliver those top 3 performances. He's had under 2 touchdown passes in 3 of his last 4, and the matchup with Calgary is a little bit scary because they're the second best team in the league against quarterbacks fantasy-wise. So it really comes down to Trevor Harris, Bo Levi Mitchell, and Nick Arbuckle. And these are all guys that typically, throughout their careers have been more so passing focused. They're not really that mobile quarterback that, people who listen to this show regularly know that I love. Trevor Harris has probably been the least mobile of them this year. He really doesn't run much at all, but they've been delivering a lot in the passing department. Trevor Harris coming off his worst game of the season, but he still threw 2+ touchdown passes for the 5th straight game. And if he can get you 300 yards and 2 touchdown passes, no interceptions, that's your 20-point week right there from Trevor Harris. And given how strong Winnipeg is against the running backs, they're also susceptible to big plays through the air. It should be a good game script for Trevor Harris to bounce back. I know he had a fantastic Labor Day game last year against the Bombers as well. How much stock do you take in that? I don't know. But I think the top 2 options I like here is this Hamilton-Toronto game is going to be a slugfest. Some sports books have the line at 57 points scored in this game, which is the highest line I've seen in probably, the last 2-3 years where I started paying attention to those. So I think there are some points to be thrown around here. And Bo Levi Mitchell, $15,000. He's averaging 36.6 pass attempts per game and has thrown 300+ yards in 7 of 10. He's also randomly actually running the ball this year a little bit more, which is surprising to see. Who knew Bo could still run or could ever run? Because I don't think he hardly did that earlier in his career. And it's a great matchup. The Argos have given up the second most fantasy points to quarterbacks on the season and the most in the last 3 games. So, it's going to be a high-scoring affair. Bo is going to be trying to come off a bad game against Saskatchewan before the bye week and right the ship there as well. I think he's one of my top 2 plays this week. But my top play at the quarterback position has to be the guy that, Wednesday night's podcast, I was claiming Nick Arbuckle for MOP of the season. And I think he has shown that he is a fantasy threat that really has to be taken seriously. He leads the entire CFL in fantasy points through 12 weeks. 1 more point than Nathan Rourke in that span. Rourke has the higher average, but Nick Arbuckle has finished as a top 3 quarterback for 5 weeks in a row, and he's averaging 25.6 points a game in that span. That is exactly what you want from your quarterback, and that's who you probably want to make as your captain if he can deliver that. It is a tough matchup against the Hamilton Tiger Cats. Quarterbacks score a significant 4 points less against the Ticats than they will do against all other teams. But I think Arbuckle is one of those guys that's a little bit matchup proof. They really don't run the ball in Toronto much, and he's averaging 35.8 pass attempts a game. So his volume should be high enough to overcome any matchup at this point. Those are your quarterback options for the week. We'll move on to the running back plays. Again, 6 teams on the field, only 6 starting running backs to choose between for this week. And, there's a situation in Toronto. Again, recording this live, what day of the week is it? It's Friday afternoon currently. First depth chart doesn't come out till Saturday. Depth chart for the Monday games doesn't come out till Sunday. So a lot of this is up in the air. Injury reports aren't even that established yet at this point. So take all the things said here with a grain of salt. Make sure you check the depth charts, of course, there as well. But at the running back position, after his performance last week, once again, how can you deny Brady Oliveira, who leads the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in targets over the last 5 games with 28? That's more than any other receiver on the team. He had 9 targets last week, 9 targets 2 weeks before that. And he's finally started scoring touchdowns. Touchdowns in 2 straight games after going 6 straight without to start the year is very good to see for Brady Oliveira. Yes, the Riders' defense is good at shutting them down on the ground, but they do allow 6.5 targets to running backs per game, second most in the CFL. And I think especially with the injuries and the question marks at wide receiver for Winnipeg, I would expect Brady Oliveira to get plenty of passes his way again. That really seems to be Zach Collaros' go-to this season. So I wouldn't be surprised to see 6-7 catches from Oliveira again, which should lead to him comfortably hitting a solid point total on the week, but he is the most expensive running back at $15,000. Call Justin Rankin Oliveira light, maybe. They're kind of the similar player, kind of in the similar boat. Very pass-heavy running back in a matchup against a team that gives up a lot of targets to them. Saskatchewan allowed the second most. Calgary allows the most. 6.7 targets per game going to running backs playing against Calgary. And Rankin's rushing usage has greatly improved the last few weeks, which was the one thing kind of holding me back from going his direction for fantasy plays. But he's got 12 plus carries and a rushing touchdown in 3 of his last 4 games. He does face a Calgary defense teams are scared to run on, and that has not allowed a single touchdown to starting running backs this entire year. So I'm not confident in the running, in the rushing touchdown coming and that rushing volume coming necessarily. But Rankin's one of those guys, and he comes in at a decent 12.9K where he's going to get enough targets, especially with Stephen Dunbar Jr. out, the top wide receiver target for the Elks. I would expect Rankin to be involved heavily in the passing game, and that's going to give a solid floor to any running back as well. Greg Bell at 13.2 thousand coming off the bye week. He's kind of the third pass catching back to talk about this week. He's averaging 7.5 fantasy points solely through the air per game this season, which has made him a reliable fantasy producer with 10 plus points in every game this year. Like, sometimes that's all you need, right? You want your lineup probably to have a mix of big boom potential plays and then some sturdy ones to go and pad it in case those booms bust, if that makes sense. So Greg Bell fits perfectly in that regard. 10 plus points in every game this year. His rushing total seems to be consistently average. All but one of his games this season have fallen between 45 and 65 rushing yards. And the Argos have actually been surprisingly good against the run on the year. Second worst matchup for running backs, but something's switched in the last 3 games, injuries and whatnot. They've been one of the best matchups for running backs in the last 3 games. They do average a pretty low 3.1 targets against. So there's possibility in Bell's dip in production if he is solely, heavily focused on the receiving yards. But I think he's a good floor play as always. Upside could be a little limited this year for Greg Bell, or for this week, sorry. Then we get into 2, again, similar running back plays in situations that I don't love, and I don't think either of these guys are in consideration for my lineup this week. AJ Ouellette at 12.9K, Dedrick Mills at 13.4. They're good for solid usage, solid rushing totals on the ground. AJ Ouellette 15 plus carries in 7 of his last 8. Dedrick Mills is almost always good for 13 plus carries and 70 plus yards on the ground. He's done that most games this year. I like Ouellette more. He's become a more legitimate pass catching threat too, 4 plus targets in 5 of his last 6 games. But he has a really, really tough matchup against Winnipeg. The league average allowed to running backs is 17.5 points per game. Winnipeg averages just 9.9 on the year. That's 8 points below average there. And, running backs score 5.1 points less than they typically do against other teams, against the Bombers. So by far the worst matchup by that metric for AJ Ouellette. He's looking to find the end zone for the first time in 5 games, but that's tough against a team that's only given up 1 to running backs all year long. And Dedrick Mills is in the same boat. He doesn't really get the pass catching ability. Outside of games against Saskatchewan, his receiving usage is rather minimal. So it all comes down to whether or not he scores the touchdown to give you a respectable week. And the Elks have only allowed 4 of those on the ground all season. And they are the second best matchup to pick running backs against on the year, but their defense has grown tremendously lately. And in the last 3 games, they've actually been the second toughest with only 11.9 points allowed, right behind Winnipeg, and 5 points less than the next toughest matchup. So, when looking at the splits and the matchups against Edmonton, it's tough because the pre-Cody Fajardo segment versus post-Fajardo taking over is remarkably different. And so I'm staying away from Dedrick Mills in that matchup because I actually believe the Elks defense is starting to look pretty good. The only team we haven't talked about yet is Toronto, and Toronto's an interesting situation because they've been rotating running backs all year. Nick Arbuckle leads the team in rushing yards on the season. That's how inconsistent they've been. They hardly ever give the ball to their running backs, but last week Deontay McMahon went down. Spencer Brown came in. He got 19 carries, 85 yards, a touchdown. He put up like a 20-point week last week and looked really, really good. Remains to be seen what the injury status is. I believe McMahon has not been practicing this week. But interestingly, Mayan Williams, who was ahead of Spencer Brown, I guess, on the depth chart earlier in the season, is a full participant in practice. And I think he's a guy with a lot of potential that we saw some flashes from. He comes in at 3,000. I would love for the depth chart to come out and have him be the starter, because that really gives you some cap relief. And I think there's not a ton of value plays at wide receiver. There's not really any value plays at quarterback this week. I think you might have to lean on whoever the starting Toronto running back is. Brown is the most expensive at 6.5. Deontay McMahon, 5.8. Mayan Williams, 3,000. So hopefully it's Mayan Williams. If not, Spencer Brown, I think, has been more productive. He looked the best out of any running back game from them all year. And so, you hope for the best. I'm not super confident, but it is the matchup. It is the most glorious matchup for a running back that you could have this week, because running backs against Hamilton averaged 22.6 points per game on the year, 26.7 in their last 3 games. Starting one of these guys is almost a must, I think, whoever the starter is, as much as people are deterred by the running back options from Toronto based on past experiences. I think the matchup is too good and the price is too good to not lock one of them in. That brings us to the receivers, and we have an interesting week with the receiver situation for multiple teams being heavily in flux. We're not going to go through all of the options necessarily on each team here, but I've got a quick, thought on each team's wide receivers and the option I like the best from them. And we're going to go in no particular order here. We're going to start with the Edmonton Elks, because this is one of my favorite wide receiver plays of week 13. I threw it out in the Discord community to see if anybody could guess who it was. Shout out to co-host Trey. He was actually the one to get it right out of everybody, because my favorite play of the week, Curly Gittens Jr. He's not a guy I've hyped up a ton this year coming into this. I don't think I've put him in my lineup once so far this season, if I remember correctly, but I think he is in for a very solid week at a good $10,000 price. Stephen Dunbar Jr. was placed on the 6-game injured list. That is a huge loss for that Elks receiving core, and that leaves them even thinner. You've got starters like Benjamin Victor, Arkell Smith, who really haven't delivered any fantasy performances of value. And then you've got Curly Gittens Jr. and Kion Julian Grant as the two notables to pick up whatever extra share of targets would normally go to Dunbar that don't just end up going to Justin Rankin, because there's a solid chance they do. I love the stability of a KGJ play at the price this week. He's had 6+ targets in his last 5 games, averaged a solid 81% catch rate on them, and he's got a solid floor. And I think that's important on a tough week like this, of not necessarily trying to swing for the fences, but I want to lean on guys like Arbuckle at quarterback, like Brady Oliveira, to deliver the big performances. And I think there's a lot of tough plays out there this week. So I want those receivers that are going to be reliable with room for more. And I think that's what I look at from a guy like Curly Gittens Jr. this week. Let's talk about Hamilton's receivers a little bit. This should be a high-scoring game. Like I said, Sportsbooks at 57 points on the over-under. And on Hamilton's side, you kind of have 3 main options to consider any given week: Kenny Waller, Tim White, and Keandre Smith. And yes, Keandre Smith is now appropriately priced at $12,000 after his worst performance of his streak. He went all the way down to $2,500. Now he's up to $12,000. Make it make sense. Of the 3 guys here that I just listed, my favorite play this week is Tim White. For all the talk, and it's constantly talked about every year, about his quiet starts to the season. Some weeks he disappears entirely. People get upset. His price is expensive in fantasy. I understand that. But White is one of those guys who shows up big time on Labor Day. And he's actually been the Ticats' leading receiver in all 4 Labor Days he's played in. In 2024, 6 receptions, 180 yards, 2 touchdowns. Year before, 8 catches, 110 yards, a touchdown. 6 catches, 56 yards, 6 catches, 93 yards, and a touchdown. Tim White has been delivering elite fantasy numbers on Labor Day 4 weeks in a row. It's a good positional matchup against the Argos as of late. I think Tim White, if you can fit him in at the price, I think he comes in over $14,000. I think he tracks to be one of the top wide receiver plays of the week. Moving over to the Prairies in Saskatchewan, it's a two-man show at wide receiver in Saskatchewan right now. Keyshawn Johnson and Dante Myers have been their top two fantasy receivers in 3 of their last 4 games. They really seem to be the go-to guys for Trevor Harris. The receiving core in Saskatchewan is going to get a little muddy in the next little bit. Ajo just re-signed with the team after trying out in the NFL with the Indianapolis Colts. Unclear if he'll be in the lineup this week yet at this point. We'll see if they can fit him in there. I imagine he rotates in for either Tommy Neild or Del Duncan Busby to take that Canadian spot if he does. And then sometime in the next couple of weeks, we're going to see Sam Emilus, Keon Schaefer-Baker all come back into the lineup. But for now, at least for this week, it's still Keyshawn Johnson, it's still Dante Myers. And it comes down to, do you want the big play potential of Dante Myers? Do you want the consistently high target volume of Keyshawn Johnson? And that's what I want, is the consistently high target volume. He lines up well against the Bombers, who give up more targets to Johnson's position of left slot back than they do to any other position on the field. Also comes at a $1,600 discount compared to Dante Myers. So if I had to pick a Riders receiver this week, Keyshawn Johnson's one that I'm strongly considering fitting in my lineup at a decent price. I want to say it was around $11,000. $11,400 is the price on Johnson this week. You have some potential moderate value plays. Joe Robustelli, Tommy Neild, they've both delivered, decent performances at different times. They come in at $6,500. If you're strapped for cash at the receiver position, I think those two are reasonable to consider against a Winnipeg defense that does give up a lot of yards. Now we go on to Calgary, and trying to pick the top Calgary fantasy receiver any given week is just a nightmare. 6 different wide receivers have finished as the team leader in fantasy points in at least one game. None have done so more than twice on the year. So who is it this week? That's an excellent question, and I don't have the answer to that. Still waiting to see what their receiving room looks like. Tevin Jones and Dominic Rhymes missed last week of practice. I believe Jones has been practicing this week. Rhymes is still kind of limited in practice, maybe not ready to go. I don't really love any of Calgary's receivers right now, but Jalen Philpott at middle slot back seems to have the best matchup based on the last 3 games. He's averaged 15.5 in his last 2. He's finished as a top 11 receiver 4 times this year, so I think there is some potential there. He is the second most expensive behind Dominic Rhymes at around $9,400 for Jalen Philpott. The only other option I would consider, if they added him to fantasy, the Game Zone fantasy site, and if he is on the starting roster, I really liked what I've seen from Dalen Baldwin the last 2 weeks. If he comes in at a cheap price and they slot him in around anything under $4,000, $5,000, I would consider playing that as my value play if I really need some money on money savings at the wide receiver position. Let's talk about Winnipeg a little bit. Winnipeg lost a couple guys due to injury last week, signed a couple guys this week, might be getting Dalton Schoen back. Jareth Stearns is officially out for this game. He was placed on the 1-game injured list. Dalton Schoen has been a full participant in practice for the last 2 weeks. My guess, and we don't have the depth charts yet, we don't have the injury report at the time of recording this, I would hazard a guess that Dalton Schoen is back in the lineup this week. And at $10,000, I think that's a pretty decent price for Schoen. And I'm not too concerned about the injury, like the return from injury rust when he's had 2 full weeks of practice before returning. Sometimes if a guy, it's his first week back, did they rush him back? I don't think they did. Dalton Schoen, can slot right back into his spot, especially with Jareth Stearns out as the number 1 touchdown target for Zach Collaros. And I like the potential of that play there. Nick Dembski seemed like it was a bad injury last week. Seems, a little iffy. Is he going to play? He has been practicing a little bit. He might still be available. Gavin Cobb's getting some playing time in practice in his spot, potentially there as well. He's not listed in fantasy, so not an option there for the Bombers to pick from the Bombers this week. Gavin Cobb isn't currently yet as well. Same thing with Kyron Moore and Cam Eccles, who are signed to the practice roster, and that might be more for depth than anything this week. So I'm not going to get into the projections of positional matchups necessarily for Winnipeg, and same thing for Toronto when we talk about them, because I think there's a lot of unknowns of who's going to line up where. But I like Dalton Schoen if he's playing. Do I love spending $10,000 on a Bombers receiver, though? No, not necessarily. Carrick Wheatfall at 6.7 thousand. If Stearns is out, if Dembski is out, if Schoen is maybe, iffy on being back, I think Wheatfall's price has dropped low enough that he is going to get some targets. He's going to be worth the price for you at that 6.7 thousand. He's one of my top kind of discounted plays of the week because there aren't a lot of good discounted plays. And then finally, the Toronto side of things. Their receiver room has been very productive for fantasy. The Toronto Argonauts have had 5 weeks where they've had 2+ members of their receiving corps have finished top 10 in wide receiver scoring. That is second to only BC on the year. And if Nick Arbuckle is going to pass as much as Nick Arbuckle's passing, then the receivers are going to catch the ball. The only wrinkle thrown into it is the signing of Mackay Polk, bringing him back from his NFL tryout. He was a 1,000-yard receiver last year. It was really one of the focal points of that offense for them. And now, how do you add him back in? And how do you, factor Jake Herslow in after he was the leading receiver in all of CFL Fantasy last week and has kind of taken the league by storm in his last couple of games with Toronto there? This is a team that typically starts 3 Canadian receivers. Kevin Mytel, Deshaun Brissett, David Unger are typically in the starting lineup. So that kind of leaves 2 spots for Devontae Coxey, Mackay Polk, Jake Herslow, and Devaris Daniels, which is going to be tough, I think, until we see that depth chart and understand how it's all going to play out. It's tough to prognosticate what this receiving core is going to look like for Toronto this week and who the best options are going to be out there. One of the hosts of the Exit and Argos podcast, I believe he also does color commentary for the Argos radio crew, Ben Grant, put this out on social media this week in response to a question about it, saying the easiest way is probably to use a designated American at wide receiver. That way you can get 25 snaps with Daniels, Coxey, Polk, and Herslow on the field, and Kevin Mytel. And then for the remaining ones, you'd either have Brissett or Unger out there with one of the Americans rotating out. So, we'll see probably a ton of different variations like that. I think that makes sense. I think the ones who are likely to lose out the most here, I see David Unger losing out because I think Brissett has been playing a lot better than Unger has. Even though Unger has been having one of the best seasons of his career there as well. I see maybe, Herslow being kind of into that more of a back into a backup role, but getting those snaps when they're able to get him out on the field due to the designated American. Or, Devaris Daniels didn't practice on the first practice day of the week. So maybe he's out of the lineup this week. Maybe Devontae Coxey's not even ready to go yet. Who knows? Check the depth charts when they come out on Sunday. But again, Toronto receivers matchup against Hamilton should be a high-scoring game. A lot of them are good fantasy options, to be honest. And finally, let's talk defenses briefly. Oh, the defense is the hardest position to pick. This is a week where the money is tough. You're probably not spending on a top-price defense. And generally, I don't recommend that anyways. But Saskatchewan at over 10,000, no thank you. Calgary against Edmonton would be a good matchup, but that's $8,000, $9,000 there, I believe. The cheapest defense play of the week is Edmonton against Calgary at $5,000. Edmonton has been playing better of late defensively. They've been getting some sacks. They've been getting some interceptions. Vernon Adams is known to throw a pick or two here, so you might get some decent play there. Edmonton's typically, shutting teams down to 20-ish, 22 points a game right now. So that helps where they're not getting slapped with that -4 necessarily. So I think it's reasonable for the Elks defense to give you, 4 or 5 points here. It's not what you hope for from a defense, but if you want points from a defense, I wouldn't spend up too much because that could really hurt the rest of your lineup on a week where you need to save the money. And Generally, I don't recommend it. I know people try to get cute with the strategy of let's start a defense on a bye to save the money. They won't get minus points. This might be one of the weeks I'd actually have to consider it. Ottawa's defense at $3,300 saves you an extra $1,700 in cap space over the Edmonton one. And if that lets you swap a guy out at, say, wide receiver for one you really believe in that's going to deliver more than you think the Elks defense is going to deliver, then I think it's worth it potentially to go that route at defense. So that's kind of what I'm tinkering with on defense as well currently. And those are your CFL fantasy options for week 13 of the CFL season. As I wrap things up here, let us know in the comments what you think of this kind of shorter form fantasy focused content, trying a couple of different things out. Did this a couple of years ago, trying to tinker with the format a little bit. And we'll be back again next Wednesday night with our Week 14 preview, a regularly scheduled time, 10 p.m. Eastern time. Look forward to that on our YouTube feed. Make sure you subscribe, like, leave all the comments and all of that whatnot. You can follow the podcast on social media at CF Countdown Pod on X or on Facebook or on Blue Sky. Check out all the other great shows from around the Canadian Football Podcast Network at CF Pod Network on Twitter, Alternative Football Network at the official AFN. You can find me at Cooper Trooper 42, but I'm often posting from the Canadian Football Countdown accounts instead. And check out the Discord and feel free to keep sending in those fantasy questions in the Discord like folks do every week. I have a lot of fun answering those. And then whatever podcast platform you're listening on, we appreciate if you do all the fun things like comment, subscribe, rate, review, share the show with your friends, help us grow the show. We always appreciate that. And thanks for tuning in on behalf of myself and the rest of the podcast crew that's not here right now. We'll see you again next week. Thank you for listening. Take care. Have a good one. Bye.